Dependency theory. The dependency theory cannot be termed as a theory, rather it is a perspective which can be used to examine development through the lenses of third world countries. For Blomstrom and Hattney, the dependency perspective represents the voices from the periphery to challenge the intellectual hegemony of the American modernization school. Raoul Previs and dependency theory. For the first time, dependency theory was developed in Latin America as a response to the bankruptcy of the program of the UNECLA in the early 1960s. The Economic Commission for Latin America (ECLA) was founded in 1948 by the UN Social and Economic Council. It was given the task of facilitating development and strengthening economic ties within the region and between the Latin American countries and the rest of the world. During its 15 years of existence, ECLA was directed by Raul Previs, who was an economist from Argentina. Previs and his colleagues were troubled by the fact that economic growth in the advanced industrialized countries did not necessarily lead to growth in the poorer countries. Therefore, he and his colleagues carried out a research work on this issue where they found that the economic activities in the richer countries of the North often lead to serious economic problems in poorer countries of South. The outcome of the research work can be found in a book named The Economic Development of Latin America and Its Principal Problems, which was authored by Raul Previs and published in the year of 1950s, where he mentioned about the whole issue. In this book, he drew attention towards the asymmetrical relationship between the wealthy industrialized countries of the North and poor countries of the South. For Previs, the asymmetrical relationship between the rich and poor countries in the global economy was due to the very structures of trade and technological adaptation that distinguished these two groups of countries, as well as to the self-perpetuating nature of the relationship between North and South. The relationship is asymmetrical because the poor countries exported primary commodities to the rich countries, who then manufactured products out of those commodities and sold them back to the poor countries at a higher price. The value added by the manufacturing a usable product always cost more than the primary products used to create those products. Because of this, poorer countries would never be earning enough from their export earnings to pay for their imports. Since the phenomenon of chronic underdevelopment within Latin America was due to the predominant reliance of countries within the region on exporting primary commodities to US and Western Europe. Therefore, Previs and his colleagues suggested for import substitution policy for the poor countries. Previs argues that the poor countries should embark on program of import substitution so that they need not purchase the manufactured products from the richer countries. But there were some issues which made this policy difficult to follow. The internal markets of the poorer countries were not large enough to support the economics of scale used by the richer countries to keep their prices low. The political will of the poorer countries as to whether a transformation from being primary products producers was possible or desirable. The third issue revolves around the extent to which the poorer countries actually had control of their primary products, particularly in the area of selling products abroad. As a result of such limitations, the import substitution policy miserably failed to bring any positive result in Latin America countries. In other words, it can be said that the ECLA programs did not succeed in the Latin American countries. Economic stagnation and political problems came to the fore in the 1960s. Such failure of the policies of the ECLA ultimately paved the way for the emergence of the dependency theory and the task of developing and popularizing the concept of dependency theory was carried out by Henry Gunder Frank. Henry Gunder Frank and dependency theory. Henry Gunder Frank was a new Marxist thinker from Latin America who further developed and popularized the dependency theory in early 1970s. Frank developed his interpretation of dependency theory with a critique of the modernization school of development. Further, he gave historical analysis of the poor condition in third world countries. The modernization school of development had an American origin. The modernization school assumes that there is something wrong inside the third world countries, such as traditional culture, overpopulation, little investment, lack of achievement, motivation, etc. And this is why the third world countries are backward and stagnant. In addition, by ignoring the history of the third world countries, the modernization school assumes that the third world countries are now at the early stage of development according to the experience of the Western countries as mentors and follow the Western path of development in order to reach modernity. But this assumption of the modernization theory of development received a great setback from Frank. He argued that the third world countries could never follow the Western path because they have experienced something that the Western countries. It is strange that the modernization school seldom discuss the factor of colonialism in details because many third world countries had been a colony for more than a century. The colonial experience has totally restructured the third world countries and drastically altered their path of development. Secondly, in reaction to the internal explanation of the modernization school, Frank offers an external explanation for third development. It neither feudalism nor traditionalism in the third world countries that explains their backwardness. In fact, it is wrong to characterize the third world countries as primitive, feudal or traditional society because many countries like China and India were quite advanced before they encountered colonialism before the 18th century. Instead, it has been the historical experience of colonialism and foreign domination that reversed the development of many advanced third world countries and forced them to move along the path of economic backwardness. In trying to capture this historical experience of the degeneration of the third world countries, Frank formulates the concept of the development of underdevelopment to denote that underdevelopment is not a natural condition, but an artifact created by the long history of colonial domination in the third world countries. For Frank, there is a fundamental difference between underdevelopment and undevelopment. Underdevelopment means a condition where resources are not being used, whereas underdevelopment is a condition where resources are actively used but used in such a way which helps the developed countries to become more and more developed. Therefore, Frank argues that the poor countries of the Third World are not naturally poor, they are made poor by developed countries. In addition, Frank has formulated a metropolis satellite model to explain how two mechanisms of underdevelopment are at work. This metropolis satellite relationship has its origin in the colonial period when the conqueror implemented new cities in the Third World with an aim to facilitate the transfer of economic surplus to the Western countries. According to Frank, the national cities then become the satellite of the Western metropolis. Further, this metropolis-satellite relation, however, is not limited to the international level because it penetrates to the regional and local levels of the Third World countries as well. Therefore, just as the national cities have become the satellites of the Western metropolises, so these satellites immediately become the colonial metropolises with respect to the provincial cities, which in turn have local cities as satellites surrounding them. A whole chain of constellation of metropolises and satellites is established to extract economic surplus in the forms of raw materials, minerals, commodities, profits it from third world villages to local capitals to regional capitals to national capitals and finally to the cities of western countries. Frank further argues that this national transfer of economic surplus has produced underdevelopment in the third world countries on the one hand and development in the western countries on the other. In other words, it can be said that the historical process which generates development in the western metropolises simultaneously generates underdevelopment in the third world satellites. Further, he argues that even after getting independence, also this chain of exploitation over the third world countries is continuing in the form of new colonialism. The industrially advanced countries invest their capital in the former colonies and use those colonies as suppliers of raw materials and potential markets for manufactured goods at higher prices. Thus, the former colonial power continues to reap economic profits as earlier without incurring the political cost of colonialism. Because of this, Frank suggests that the third world countries should delink their ties with the developed countries. They should cut off their relation with the developed countries. The development of the South-South cooperation can be considered as a response to this proposal. World System Theory. The world system theory developed by Wallerstein is also associated with dependency theory. This theory basically deals with the world economic system, which is based on international division of labor. The division of labor exists amongst the countries. Wallerstein proposes three different categories: core, semi-periphery, into which all regions of the world can be placed. The categories describe each region's relative position within the world economy as well as certain internal political and economic characters. Core countries. The countries which are placed within the core region are basically featured by the strong central governments, extensive bureaucracies, and large mercenary armies. These countries are largely benefited from the capitalist world economy. The core countries enriched themselves at the expense of the periphery countries. Periphery countries. The countries which are located within periphery region are featured by weak central governments or controlled by other states, exported raw materials to the core and relied on coercive labor practices. The core expropriated much of the capital surplus generated by the periphery through unequal trade relations. According to Wellstein, Eastern Europe, particularly Poland and Latin America, exhibited characteristics of peripheral regions. Semi-periphery countries. The countries which are located within this region are exhibit the quality of both core and periphery countries. They often served as buffers between the core and periphery countries. The countries of core which are declining for any region automatically shift to semi-periphery region. So during the study period, the countries which fell within this region were Portugal and Spain. Economically, these particular countries retained limited but declining access to international banking and the production of high-cost, high-quality manufactured goods. Unlike the core, however, they failed to predominate in international trade and thus did not benefit to the same extent as the core. However, within the core and periphery also there is a hierarchy. Through this model, Wallerstein basically argues that the development of capitalist world economy is detrimental to a large proportion of the world's population. Further, he argues that though the capitalist world economy is dynamic in nature which changes over time, but some of its features remain same, and one amongst them is that the core regions of the northwestern Europe clearly benefits the most from this management. The advanced countries still exercise their control over the third world countries through the medium of IMF, World Bank, which are the popular instruments of capitalism. Conclusion. Thus, it can be said that the dependency theory particularly targets the capitalist economic system and suggests the third world countries have to delink their ties with the development capitalist countries as their dependency on developed countries make their condition more pathetic and poor. But if we see the relevancy of the theory at present context, then it can be found that this theory failed to explain the rise of Asian tigers, namely Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. These four countries have consistently maintained high levels of economic growth since the 1960s by following rapid industrialization and open market. Further, the shifting of Indian economy towards the liberalization in the year of 1991 further gave a setback to this theory. At present, it is difficult to remain aloof from the world economy. Most of the countries are now following the path of open economy. Even China, which follows communist ideology, also adopts open economy. There is no doubt that exploitation is still continuing in the form of new colonialism, but it has operated at a very subtle level that no one can directly point it out.